Here. Hi to everybody out there. Thanks for coming out tonight. I'm Derek. I'm one of the reference librarians here. Just a few little announcements before I introduce our author. We have a Q&A on the bottom of the toolbar there that you can ask questions. We'll have plenty of time after the presentation so you can ask our author some questions. And then also on the right-hand side, there's a chat box, and we'll have the link for this newest book here from the Learned Owl, so you can purchase it there on the link on the right-hand side. So let's introduce the author. So tonight we have with us John Ferling, and he's going to talk about this book here, Winning Independence, The Decisive Years of the Revolutionary War. And he has his BA in History from Sam Houston State University, MA degree in History from Baylor University, and PhD from West Virginia University. And he's written numerous books on the American Revolution, such as Jefferson and Hamilton, The Rivalry That Forged a Nation, Whirlwind, The American Revolution War That Won It, Apostolates of Revolution, Jefferson, Payne, and Monroe, and the Struggle Against the Old Order in America and Europe. Also, Almost a Miracle, The American Victory in the War of Independence. He's appeared on television on many PBS documentaries, the History Channel, C-SPAN, and other things. And he's coming from us from live in Atlanta. So we'd like to thank you for coming out tonight, and he's going to speak to us about his newest book.
Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I've been looking forward to it since this was arranged quite a while ago. Let me begin by saying that a couple of years ago, I rewatched one of my favorite movies, The Two Jakes, and this time around, a line that Jack Nicholson uttered in the movie that I had never really noticed before captured my attention. And Nicholson said, "You can't forget the past any more than you can change it." And I think the reason that the line captured my attention this time around was that I was writing about the 4 years of the war after Saratoga, and I was very much conscious that while the Revolutionary War hadn't been forgotten, I think the first 30 months of the war down to Saratoga is much better remembered than the 4 years that I was writing about. People remember battles like Bunker Hill and Trenton and Princeton that occurred before Saratoga much better than they remember battles like Cowpens and Guilford Courthouse and whatever that were nevertheless crucial battles leading to the decisive battle at Yorktown in 1781. I don't want to take a lot of time to go into why that first 30 months is better remembered, except just to say quickly that I think Saratoga is often depicted in textbooks and whatever as the turning point of the revolution. And I think because of that, many people have perhaps thought that everything that followed Saratoga was anticlimactic and that the American victory was guaranteed. And what I try to argue in Winning Independence is that that was hardly the case, that there was a 4-year-long grim war that followed, and that more Americans died in the 4 years after Saratoga than during the 30 months before Saratoga. And that I also tried to argue that the outcome of the war was far from certain deep into 1781. It could have gone other ways, not necessarily with a British victory, but it could have ended in something less than American independence. And I'll try to talk about that as we go on tonight. Certainly, after Saratoga, there was a great deal of optimism in America about the war, and one of the individuals who was the most optimistic was General George Washington. Just a few weeks after Saratoga, he said that he thought things were now fast verging to a favorable issue. And a few weeks after that, when France allied with the United States and was coming into the war to help us with the fighting, Washington was even more optimistic. The French alliance must put the independence of America out of all manner of dispute, Washington said. So I think Washington thought in early 1778, he was making these comments while he was at Valley Forge, by the way. I think he was moved to make these comments because he thought that time was now on America's side. The British had not been able to defeat America before France came into the war. How could they possibly defeat both France and the United States? So that early in 1778, I think Washington felt that within a relatively short period of time, probably sometime during 1778, one of two things was likely to happen. Either the Allies would score a decisive victory over the British, forcing the British out of the war, forcing Great Britain to grant America its independence, or that Britain would simply see the futility of staying in the war, and they would throw in the towel and negotiate an end to the conflict, and that negotiation would lead to their granting America its independence. During that winter at Valley Forge, Washington did not say very much about what he planned to do down the road, but he did say one thing that was intriguing, and he said that from this point on, he would avoid impetuosity. He would not act impetuously. And he didn't say what he really meant by that comment, but I think looking at what Washington's behavior during the next 4 years, what he was thinking was that from this point forward, he would act only with the blessing of the French and only in concert with the French. So that was how Washington looked at things at this point in 1778. And if Washington was optimistic, just the opposite feeling gripped London once it received the word of Saratoga. Many people in England wanted to drop out of the war. Many wanted to simply, let's make peace now before France comes in to the conflict. And it triggered a weeks-long, actually months-long debate within the ministry of Frederick Lord North, who was the British Prime Minister at the time. And the debate sort of revolved around, should Britain remain in the war? And if it chose to remain in the war, what kind of strategy would it pursue down the road? Clearly, the strategy that the British had pursued during the first 30 months of the war had not succeeded. They had tried to destroy Washington's Continental Army. That had not occurred, and they had tried to win control of several northern colonies, and that hadn't occurred either. So some sort of new strategy had to be developed by the British. And ultimately, those who wanted to continue the war won the battle. And the person who really led the fight to stay in the war was Lord George Germain. Germain was held the position of American Secretary or Secretary of State for the American colonies. And that position made Germain, in essence, a minister of war, but it also he gave him responsibility for the British Army in North America. So he'll play a pivotal role from this point on, as he had for the couple of years previously. And Germain was the architect of the new strategy that the ministry embraced at the end of this long debate. And the strategy that Germain pushed was a strategy that became known as the Southern strategy. He now thought that Britain had to turn its back on the North, where it had been unsuccessful, and attempt to regain control of 2 or possibly 3 Southern colonies, Georgia and South Carolina for certain, and possibly North Carolina. All 3 of those colonies were extremely economically important to Britain. They produced rice, they produced indigo, they produced timber products that were crucial in the ship construction industry, and so forth. And so, not only would this affect the United States after the war, but it would be a positive development for the British. And in fact, if Cornwallis's Southern strategy panned out, then the map of North America might have looked something like this at the end of the war. The area that's shaded in red on the map would have been the United States. And you can see it's obviously much smaller than the United States that did come into being in 1783. And it would have been completely surrounded by British territory. If the British took Georgia and South Carolina and North Carolina down below the Virginia border, they already possessed East and West Florida, which they had gained in a war with Spain back in the 1760s. They still controlled the Trans-Appalachian West, and they controlled Canada. So the United States would have been encircled by a great power and unable to expand. It would have faced an uncertain and a rather bleak future. So that was what Germain came up with, and he thought that the Southern strategy was a viable strategy because he believed, probably correctly, that a great many Southern colonists remained loyal to England. And in fact, historians have demonstrated that a greater percentage of Southerners did remain loyal to England than was true in the northern colonies. And they would be an element that could serve in the British Army. They could serve in militia units and whatever, and they would be a vital element in winning control of 2 or 3 southern colonies. So Germain wins the battle in the cabinet, and the first thing he has to do after he wins that battle in the cabinet is he has to select a new commander, because the previous commander-in-chief of the British forces in North America, General William Howe, resigned following Saratoga. And so Germain turns to Sir Henry Clinton to be the new commander-in-chief. And Clinton was 48 years old in May of 1778 when he learned of his appointment. He came from an aristocratic family in England. His father had been a career officer in the Royal Navy, who had gone on to serve as Royal Governor of New York. And young Henry, in fact, spent part of his youth growing up in New York City. Clinton entered the British Army when he was still a teenager, and he served in 2 wars, fought, in fact, in 2 wars before the Revolutionary War. And he earned a reputation as a brave, courageous, risk-taking soldier, and indeed he he was seriously wounded in a battle in Germany in the 7 Years' War in the early 1760s. Clinton was an intellectually curious individual. He read widely, read especially deeply in military history and military strategy. In the year before the Revolutionary War broke out, he paid out of his own pocket to make a trip deep into Eastern Europe to observe a war between Russia and the Turks, hoping to learn more about military strategy and tactics. The next year, 1775, Clinton, who is a major general, was sent to America. He was the third ranking general behind Thomas Gage and William Howe in the British Army when he arrived in Boston just a few weeks after Lexington and Concord and just before Bunker Hill. In fact, he got there just in time to participate in the engagement in Bunker Hill. And during the next 30 months down through Saratoga, Clinton served, had a distinguished record of service, and he won something of a reputation as a person who was not just a gifted strategist, but perhaps the best strategic thinker among Britain's officers in America. So he now gets a letter from Germain in May of 1778 that tells him he's the new commander-in-chief. He was delighted about that, but once he read his orders, he blanched because the orders were for Clinton to yield Philadelphia, which the British had just taken at some cost, and to relinquish 8,000 of his troops, who were to be sent chiefly to the Caribbean to contend with the new threat posed by France. So Clinton knew from the very beginning that he would have an army that would be perhaps 1/3 smaller than the British army that had been in America a year before and hadn't been successful at that. And despite that, he was ordered to try to bring Washington to battle, to hold on to New York, to hold on to Newport, Rhode Island, and to begin implementing this Southern strategy that Germain had devised. And Clinton's reaction to that, as he wrote to a friend back in England, was, "My fate is hard." He said in that letter to his friend that he now thought that Britain's defeat in this war was inevitable, and that he feared that when that inevitable defeat occurred, he would be scapegoated for the defeat. And in that sense, Clinton was prescient because following Yorktown, many in England denounced Clinton, portraying him as being too passive, as refusing to take risks. Had he done more, they suggested Britain might have won the war, and so forth. And many historians picked up on those arguments. I think they were unfair, and in my book, I try to characterize Clinton as a general who, like all of the other generals in this war, made some mistakes, but that by and large, he was a good general, and he did not deserve blame for Britain having lost the war. In fact, even though he thought in 1778 that Britain's defeat was inevitable, as I'll try to show as we go on tonight, he came much closer than he or anybody else thought possible to avoiding that defeat and getting Britain out of this war with some gains before it was over. I think the most devastating critique of Clinton was offered about 75 years ago, and people still read the essay. It was written by Clinton's principal biographer in conjunction with a clinical psychologist. And they argued that Clinton sought power, but that he had deep subliminal problems that prevented him from exercising the power once he got it, and that doomed him to failure. And I think that argument was just absolutely rubbish. I mean, they could not, of course, put Clinton on the couch, and besides, even more tellingly, Clinton left behind virtually no private letters that might have opened a window onto his inner self. So I think that study ought to be filed in the circular file. Well, let me go on by saying that despite Clinton's reputation as a do-nothing general, the moment that he took power, he faced a series of crises, more crises in a short period of time than any other British commander during this war faced. And he met each of those challenges resolutely, and he did take risks in meeting those challenges, contrary to the appraisal later on of contemporaries and of historians. First, he had to get his army from Philadelphia back to New York. And rather than going the safe way by sea, he took his army marched his army across New Jersey in the hopes that Washington would attack. He hoped to bring Washington to battle. And Washington obliged. Washington did attack at the end of June, and the Battle of Monmouth, which was the last major battle fought in the North in this war, occurred. Turned out to be an indecisive battle. Clinton no more than got his army to New York, and he faced an even bigger crisis. A French fleet arrived, a fleet that was greater than the British fleet in New York, and Britain's possession of New York was now threatened by the possibility of an attack on the Royal Navy by the French fleet and a simultaneous attack by the Continental Army on Britain's fortifications in New York. As it turned out, the crisis went away in part because the commander of the French fleet, Comte d'Estaing, could not get his heavy warships across the bar into New York Harbor. But Clinton also played a role in frustrating d'Estaing. Clinton immediately rushed men and artillery to nearby islands, and from those islands, they could pepper any British ships, any French ships that got too close to the harbor. And no less than the second in command of the Royal Navy lauded Clinton as the savior of New York. Clinton immediately faced a third crisis after that. Clinton reasoned that Washington and d'Estaing, frustrated in New York, would go after Newport, Rhode Island, which the British had had since Clinton had retaken it back in 1776. And so Clinton immediately rushed reinforcements and provisions to the army that was posted in Newport, so in hopes that it could withstand an Allied siege or an Allied attack. Clinton acted so quickly, in fact, that he got his reinforcements there about 3 weeks before d'Estaing arrived in Rhode Island. And once again, the Allies were frustrated. This time it was because a great storm roared out of the Atlantic, and it caused considerable damage to the French fleet, which forced it to limp up to Boston for for repairs. So Clinton soon spotted an opportunity to act now that the French fleet was gone, because an American army of 7,000 men remained on Aquidneck Island, where Newport is located. And Clinton thought he conceived a strategy that could have led to Saratoga in reverse. Those 7,000 Americans could be captured. And Clinton's plan was for him to cobble together an expedition of 77 ships and 4,300 men, and personally lead that expedition to Aquidneck Island. And his plan was that the British Army in Newport, at the southern end of Newport, would advance from the north on the Americans, while Clinton's expedition landed on the north end of Aquidneck Island, and the American army would be caught in between. It was a grand plan, and it came literally within hours of working. But many generals were frustrated by things beyond their control in this war, and this was a case where Clinton was. His expedition ran into contrary winds. It took a long time to make a short voyage from New York to Rhode Island. The American commander, John Sullivan, in Rhode Island, realized what was going on, and he got he extricated his army from Aquidneck Island only hours before Clinton landed at the north end. So all through 1778, despite the subsequent portrayal of Clinton as a do-nothing general, had acted resolutely and decisively in meeting each of these challenges and coming within a whisker of succeeding. Soon thereafter, D'Estaing sailed off to the Caribbean to deal with the French. And Clinton at last relinquished those 8,000 men that he had been ordered to give up several months before. The very nerves of my army has dissolved, was what he told Germain when he yielded those 8,000 men. And he also told Germain that he would have to remain on the defensive now until he was reinforced. And it's true that throughout 1779, Clinton did not undertake any huge offensives, but he was not idle. He was not a do-nothing general, as many have said. While Washington remained true to his pledge not to act with impetuosity, and he remained out of the field, Clinton did a number of things. Clinton sent a 3,000-man expedition to Georgia, which retook Savannah in a one-day engagement, and reinstalled the royal governor of Georgia and the royal legislature in Georgia, which immediately repealed every revolutionary act that had been passed since 1776 in the colony. Clinton also sent a large naval land force to Virginia in May of 1779. And that force put the torch to thousands of acres of crops in eastern Virginia. It destroyed a number of ship construction facilities. It liberated hundreds of slaves. And when that same expedition returned to New York, Clinton immediately sent it up the Hudson River, where it took two Continental Army posts at King's Ferry, Stony Point and Verplank's Point. And what Clinton was trying to do in taking those installations was cause logistical and communication problems for the Continental Army. And Washington confessed that Clinton had done just that. And in fact, Washington privately praised Clinton before he's acting, said he thought it was the smartest thing that Clinton had done to this point in the war. And of course, what Clinton was hoping was that Washington would be lured into the field to try to undo what Clinton had done. But Washington didn't take the bait. And in fact, Washington said, we can only lament what we cannot remedy. And so Clinton failed in bringing Washington to battle. So he had been pretty active despite later arguments. But there was one thing that Clinton might have done in 1779, and he didn't do it, and he was criticized subsequently for not having taken the step, and that was he did not go after the American installation at West Point on the Hudson River. That was America's key installation. If the British could take West Point, it would control the Hudson River from New York City to Albany, and they would win the war with that, because the 4 New England colonies would be detached from the other 9 colonies or states, and America simply could not continue the war without those 4 important New England states. But Clinton did not act against West Point. And I think Clinton made the prudent choice in not taking that step. And the reason I say that is that, for one thing, Clinton knew nothing about the installation at West Point. The scholar who has studied the British intelligence network the most carefully argued that at this point, Britain's intelligence network was still really primitive, and it wasn't souped up until Clinton had a chance to remold it over the first 3 or 4 years that he was the commander. So he really didn't know what he would be going up against, but he did know that Washington would do everything he could possibly do to hold on to West Point, which meant that he would use every Continental soldier and every militiaman that he could get his hands on, so that Clinton, in essence, would be acting blindly against a numerically superior adversary had he tried to take West Point. And then finally, I think the reason I think Clinton was prudent was that General Henry Knox, Washington's artillery chief, who did know West Point really well, and Knox in June of 1779, at the very moment that the Americans were expecting Clinton to attack, said that he did not think that the British could take West Point either by a siege or by an attack. So I think had Clinton acted, he would have probably lost heavily there and gained nothing. And all in all, I think he probably made the prudent choice. But there was another thing I think that was probably on Clinton's mind at this point, and that was that, if you remember when I first started tonight, I said that in early 1778, I think Washington felt that time was on his side. But by the middle of 1779, things had swung around, and Clinton believed that time was on his side. And one reason for that was that the American economy had absolutely collapsed by this point. There was just runaway inflation. As Washington put it, the value of money is melting like snow under a hot sun. And a horse that had sold for 10 pounds in 1776 was now selling for 200 pounds. And in addition to the economy having collapsed, and Clinton reasoned that that wouldn't mean that the Americans would have to drop out of the war immediately, but it did mean that they could not fight indefinitely in this war with this kind of economy. And Clinton also began to see some signs of American morale breaking down. And I'm sure the economic collapse contributed to that, But also, if you think about it, by 1779, 2 years had elapsed since Saratoga. And in those 2 years, the Americans had not gained a single victory. And a year had elapsed since France had come into the war. And during that year, the French had gained absolutely nothing in this war. So people now understood that this was going to be a long, grim war. They would have to make lots of sacrifices. And I don't mean to imply that morale had collapsed to the point that America was about to drop out of the war, but if morale continued to suffer, then there would be consequences down the road. So Clinton, during the last 6 months of 1779, did not take any great actions. But in early 1780, the French Navy was gone again, and Clinton realized that now was the time to put into effect the Southern strategy of Germain. He'd already done that by retaking Savannah and parts of Georgia. But at the very beginning of 1780, he put together a large expedition and personally led it to South Carolina, and in April and May of 1780 conducted a siege operation of Charleston. And at the end of several weeks, Charleston capitulated, and 5,000 American troops were surrendered there. This is really America's Saratoga. I have to confess, I didn't realize until I was reading today's paper, which has one of those little things, what happened on this day. And it turned out on May the 12th, 1780 was the day that Charleston surrendered. So this is whatever number of years it would be since 1780, 241 years or something, if my math is right. So anyway, he wins a substantial victory there. It is, as I said, America's Saratoga. They've lost 5,000 men. They've lost an important city. Many in England thought that Clinton's victory, which was the greatest victory achieved by a British general in this war, had saved Lord North's war ministry. And one of Clinton's friends wrote him that summer telling him that he was now the most popular man in England. That wouldn't last, but in the summer of 1780, that was the case. So now the Southern strategy can begin in earnest. And Clinton does not stick around in Charleston, South Carolina. He comes back to New York rather quickly, and he appoints General Charles Cornwallis, who was his second in command, he made Cornwallis responsible for ending the rebellion in South Carolina and Georgia. And he leaves Cornwallis with an army of more than 8,000 men, which is expected to grow and did grow as loyalists came into the army as regulars, joining what became known as provincial regiments, and others went into loyalist militia units. And the idea was that the British Army would drive the rebels out of an area, and then the loyalist militia would come in and occupy that area and pacify the area. And things went very well for Cornwallis initially. He in fact, by July, a month after taking command, is telling Clinton that he thinks the rebellion in South Carolina is virtually over. And a month later, in August of 1780, he has even better news for Clinton, and that is that he has scored a sensational victory over a rebel army led by General Horatio Gates at Camden in South Carolina. It was the fourth rebel army, Fourth American Army, to be utterly defeated in the Southern Theater in a 20-month period. More than 8,000 American soldiers had been killed, wounded, and or captured in those four huge losses. And not coincidentally, in that same month of August 1780, when the British scored this victory, their latest victory at Camden, General Washington is writing to an acquaintance of his, and he says, "I have almost ceased to hope." That Washington, who had been so ecstatic back in 1778, now a little bit more than 2 years later, is confessing that he has almost ceased to hope that America could gain its independence. And at the same moment, and in a sense even more tellingly, because you couldn't always believe everything that Washington said. Sometimes, I don't mean to say that he was a liar, but sometimes he would say things in the hope that it would mobilize people, get them into doing more. But at the same moment, in August of 1770 or 1780, Arthur Lee of Virginia, who had been an American diplomat in Europe since the beginning of the war, returned to America for the first time since before the war began. And Lee landed in Boston, and he spent a few days there before he returned to Virginia. And while he was there, he talked with a number of authorities in Boston, a number of Massachusetts authorities, and Lee said that he came away with the conclusion that most of the leaders in Massachusetts now believed that it was inevitable that the war would end in a negotiated settlement that did not recognize American independence. In other words, at this point, many people in Boston of all places, if you stop and think about it, despaired for independence. And it was beginning to look like that map that I showed you earlier of America, that might have even been too optimistic, the way things were going. But soon the war began to turn around, and it began to turn because of two reasons: a vibrant partisan resistance movement developed in the South that caused all kinds of problems for Clinton's army. And at the same time, Cornwallis met a number of, ran into a number of defeats at Kings Mountain in October of 1780, at Cowpens in January 1781, at Guilford Courthouse in March of 1781. And in all of those engagements combined, he winds up losing about 40% of the army that he had started with. So Cornwallis now is in some trouble. And before Clinton was fully aware of all of those defeats, but after the first defeat at Kings Mountain, Clinton began to rethink Southern strategy. And remember at the very beginning when I introduced you to Clinton, I said that Clinton had won a reputation as a sort of a master strategist, and he now begins to rethink the strategy that might win the war in the South. And what he comes up with is a strategy that I think, had it been permitted to play out, could have won control of 2 or maybe 3 Southern colonies. Clinton reasoned that the rebel resistance in the Low Country and the South was sustained by the flow of supplies, munitions, and weaponry and clothing and whatever from outside. Most of those supplies were acquired from abroad, came in through New England ports, came down through Philadelphia, then through Maryland and Delaware into Virginia, down through Virginia into North Carolina, principally through Charlotte and North Carolina, and down into South Carolina and Georgia, where they went into the hands of rebel armies and of those partisans. And Clinton realized or came to the conclusion that if he could stop the flow of supplies in through Virginia down into the Carolinas and Georgia, then the rebel resistance would have to dry up, and the British would regain control of those three colonies. And so what Clinton did starting in December of 1780 and then continuing in the spring of 1781, was he put for the first time a large British army in Virginia. It was an army of about 6,000 men. And the purpose of the army was to destroy rebel supply depots in Virginia, interdict the flow of supplies through Virginia. And one other benefit of it would be that given the fact that there was a huge British army in Virginia, Virginia's governor, Thomas Jefferson, would have to keep his militia at home. And those militiamen would not be there in the low country to fight alongside North Carolinians and South Carolinians and whatever. It was, I think, a winnable plan that Clinton devised, but it was frustrated by two things. One was that despite the fact that from day one, Cornwallis's orders had been to focus on South Carolina. That was the focal point of what he was to do. Cornwallis, despite those orders, violated his orders. He abandoned South Carolina and brought his army to Virginia in May of 1781. All along, Clinton had planned to remove all but about 2,000 men from Virginia during the summer of 1781. They weren't to be there permanently because he thought that in 1781 the Allies had to score a decisive victory. The British intelligence was reported to drop out of the war. It accomplished nothing, was spending money hand over fist for nothing. And so it had to score a decisive victory. And John Adams, an American diplomat in Europe, was telling Congress the same thing. So Clinton thought there would be a showdown someplace. It could be in Virginia. It could be in New York. He guessed that it would be in New York. And so his plan was to remove all but 2,000 troops from Virginia and bring them to New York. And he actually sent orders to Cornwallis in June of 1780 to send the first installment to New York, 3,000 men and a whole batch of artillery. And this was an order that Cornwallis complied with. He was loading those troops onto transports when, when he received another order from Clinton countermanding the previous order. And the reason that Clinton changed his mind was that he had heard from Germain in London, and Germain told him that he and the king did not want one single soldier removed from Virginia. So instead of an army of 2,000 men in Virginia, there's an army of 7,500 men. And that was so enticing that the Allies did not go after New York. To Clinton's disappointment, they went after Cornwallis at Yorktown, and you know the rest of the story. So Clinton was prescient. The British defeat turned out to be inevitable, as he said at the moment that he learned of his appointment, but that he came much closer, I think, than many people realize today to winning control of 2 or 3 southern colonies that could have reshaped the United States in not particularly friendly ways after the war. Well, thank you very much. I look forward to taking some questions and hope I'll be able to answer them.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have some questions coming in, so we'll just start in it. We have one talking about the British Loyalists. You did talk about it briefly, but what happened after the war when the American Revolution is won? How were they treated by the colonists?
Well, a great many of the Loyalists left. When the British evacuated Savannah and Charleston in 1781, many of the Loyalists sailed away with them, and other Loyalists in other colonies left as well. Many went to the West Indies. Many went to Canada, where new colonies were formed, sort of especially for the Loyalists. Some went to England. Of course, not every Loyalist got out, and I think the treatment just depended on local circumstances. Some were ostracized. Some had their property confiscated. You remember Thomas Paine, that authored Common Sense and the American Crisis? He was given a farm in New Rochelle, New York, that had belonged to a Loyalist family and had been confiscated. But in other places, they weren't badly treated, and you even had it wasn't very common, but you even had a couple of cases of people who had been Loyalists who got elected to political office, at least at the state level after the war.
Okay, great. So in your book, you talk about a gentleman, I wrote it down here because I always butcher his name, Banistar Tarleton.
Right, Banistar Tarleton, right.
Is he a bit of a loose cannon, or do you think he's a little misunderstood by historians? What's your take on him?
Yeah, well, I think Cornwallis had some reservations about him. He certainly used Tarleton. He was the head of his cavalry. He had a Loyalist unit, in fact, that consisted mostly of men who had been recruited in Pennsylvania and New Jersey back in 1778. There were a few Southerners in there, and he was kind of the eyes and ears intelligence gatherer for Cornwallis. But I think one telling thing is when Cornwallis marched his army from North Carolina up to Virginia in the spring of 1781, he sent Tarleton ahead, but his orders were, don't do anything that's provocative. We don't want to be attacked up here by people. We don't want you stirring things up. So I think Cornwallis knew that he could be a hothead. And by the way, when the surrender in Yorktown, there were really two British armies. The main army was in Yorktown, and then there was another British force right across the river in Gloucester, and Tarleton was over there. And so there were two surrenders, one in Yorktown and one in Gloucester. And when the surrender took place in Gloucester, Tarleton went to a French officer and he said, look, can you put me in an inconspicuous place? Because I have a feeling that one of these crazy Virginians is going to draw a bead on me. And the French officer complied, and Tarleton was able to survive that.
Oh, wonderful. So we have a question that asks about Lord Rodney, and he didn't show up for the Battle of Yorktown. Could he have made a difference if he did show up?
This is Admiral Rodney, or?
I think so. Yeah, it says Lord Rodney.
Yeah,
so,
no.
Yeah.
He had gone back to France. He was expected to bring his fleet from the Caribbean to America to really follow Admiral de Grasse when de Grasse sailed in August from the Caribbean. And Rodney was ill, and he chose to go back to France with the convoy that was taking all kind of produce. I think he could have made a difference. He was regarded as the best of the British admirals down in the Caribbean, and I think he could have scraped together more ships than his replacement was able to scrape together to bring up to North America. As it turned out, the French had maritime supremacy in Yorktown. That's obviously the key to the British victory. So that Rodney could have possibly made a difference.
Okay, great. So we have a question asking about Clinton and Cornwallis. What was their working relationship in England after the war?
Okay, well, I'm actually writing an article on that right now. It wasn't good. I'll tell you that. They had over the years an off and on relationship. They had both fought in Germany during the 7 Years' War. They got to know one another there. They had a long, fairly cordial, very, very cordial relationship. And but then in 1776, they were both serving under General Howe, and Clinton, in a private conversation with Cornwallis, complained to him about Howe's generalship. And Cornwallis betrayed his trust by going to Howe and telling Howe what Clinton had said. And so Clinton broke off his ties with Cornwallis. And for a couple of years, they weren't close together. And then I guess time healed all wounds, and some intermediaries brought them together. And they had a pretty good relationship when they went down to South Carolina, with Clinton in command and Cornwallis second in command for the siege of Charleston. But at that point, Clinton he was frustrated. He felt that Germain was too intrusive. He was telling him what to do all the time. He wanted out, and he had asked to be relieved of his command and permitted to return home. And that would mean that Cornwallis would be named the commander in his stead. And everybody thought that would happen. And right in the middle of the siege of Charleston, they finally hear, after about 7 months from Germain, and Germain said, "Neither the king or I will hear to your resignation." And so Cornwallis seemed to immediately change. It was like a Jekyll and a Hyde. He turned on Clinton, and Clinton felt that he was trying to stir up officers against him, and they had a really sour relationship. And after Yorktown, it grew even more sour, and it developed into a long pamphlet war. Clinton writing almost all of the pamphlets, trying to defend himself and to assail Cornwallis, while Cornwallis tried to defend himself. And Cornwallis really got the better of it, I think. He amazingly, even though he had violated his orders in coming to Virginia, and he was the loser in Yorktown, he was welcomed when he got back to England as a hero, and Clinton was seen as the villain when he got back to England. So it's one of those cases of history playing strange tricks. I think in this case, because Cornwallis was a far better politician than was Clinton.
We have a question about your research. They're wondering, it looks like you had access to a number of resources. Can you kind of talk about those primary sources that you used?
Yeah, actually, I was able to do most of the research right in the library at the University of West Georgia. Over the last 30 or 40 years, we've built up a really nice collection of materials on the Revolutionary War. There's a lot of things out that's online now, so I didn't have to travel. I could get electronic editions. And the big thing is, 4 or 5 years ago, I don't know if you can see this or not, but the Cornwallis Papers were published. And they had always been in England and in archives there. And an English scholar produced a 6-volume collection of those letters. It's just for Cornwallis in the South. So it just covers 1780 and 1781. But there's letters between Cornwallis and his subordinates, between Clinton and Cornwallis, Cornwallis and Germain, and whatever. And also, there's, I don't know if you can see this very well or not, but there's a 23-volume series that came out, the Irish University Press, called Documents of the American Revolution. And there's just thousands of documents in there exchanged between officials in England and in America. So those were some of the sources, plus, of course, the letters of Washington, the letters of Jefferson, Nathaniel Greene's correspondence has all been published now. So there's just a wealth of material in print out there. And the result was really the only traveling I had to do is I went to Ann Arbor, Michigan, and the Clinton papers are at the Clements Library on the University of Michigan campus. I can't remember how they acquired them, but they acquired them, I think, in the 1920s. It's a beautiful place to work, and everything's well indexed and whatever. And the librarians there are just couldn't be more helpful and cooperative. But that was really the only trip that I think I had to make.
So speaking of Washington, there's somebody that has a question about Washington, specifically the battles that he won. Obviously Yorktown, but what about some of the other ones? He went through a stretch of 3 years where he didn't win anything. How did he remain successful?
Yeah, well, he didn't win any major battles other than Yorktown after Saratoga. And there had been, Washington had made in 1776 a number of mistakes in the New York campaign, and he made some mistakes in the Pennsylvania campaign when General Howe went after Philadelphia in 1777. And it led to a movement among some members of Congress and other people to get rid of Washington. And I don't think Congress really seriously entertained that notion. I think they felt that if they did remove Washington, that it would just cause political turmoil. France might not come into the war, in fact, in that situation. And it would probably be ruinous to the American cause. So what Congress did, starting during the Valley Forge winter, was it began to take pains to stifle the criticism of Washington, but also at the same time to try to make Washington an iconic figure. It would do things like annually celebrating Washington's birthday, for instance. And the result was that now nobody attacked Washington publicly. It was just off limits. And so he was able to ride it out. And I think all in all, Washington made the right decision. He was risk averse. He was less active than Clinton was, but that vow of his that he wouldn't act with impetuosity was probably the right strategy on Washington's part. He saved his army, and when the French were finally at last ready to cooperate with him, he and the French went after Cornwallis and Yorktown and won the war.
So we have a question here that asks about the American Revolution. Was it a subset of the 7 Years' War between the French and the British empires?
Well, in a sense, it was the French had lost the 7 Years' War to the British, and they I think were interested in particular in redressing the balance of power in Europe as a result of this. They began rebuilding their army, their navy rather, almost immediately after the 7 Years' War, and I think probably looking for an opportunity that would offset some of the things that they had lost during the 7 Years' War, so that when the protests began in the colonies with the Stamp Act 11 years before independence is declared, the French send over secret agents to America to sort of snoop around and decide and to learn whether or not this might turn into a revolution, and was there anything that the French could do. So they watched the situation very, very carefully, but they were hesitant to bet on. They feared that they didn't want to bet on a loser, and so they did provide some clandestine support for America in 1775 and 76. They didn't come into the war until after Saratoga, and at that point they felt it was pretty safe to come in.
Okay, we have a question asking, what if? What if the Southern strategy did work? Would there have been a French Revolution?
Oh, well, I don't know that I can answer that, but what I can say is that the French suffered severe economic damages because of all of the aid that they provided to the Americans. They made a number of loans to the Americans, some outright gifts to the Americans, which drove them deeper and deeper into debt. And then ultimately, to deal with that economic crisis, the king had to call the Estates General into session, and that started the ball rolling. It's hard to say what would have happened if the United States had come out as just a really small a nation. I think, as I said in my talk, it would have faced a really dark, uncertain future. And many historians feel that ultimately what probably would have happened is that momentum would have built to possibly return to the British Empire. I mean, they could have gotten a pretty good deal, but they wouldn't have been independent. They would have gotten everything that they had asked for at the First Continental Congress. And in fact, Lord North, after Saratoga, offered them everything that they had asked for at the First Continental Congress. They hadn't asked for independence at that point. That was still 18 months or so before independence was declared. But they were willing to give them everything else that they had asked for. So America would have been far more autonomous than it had been before the war, but not independent. But what ifs? I always used to tell my class when I would get a what if question, it's hard enough to understand what did happen. It's really hard to imagine what might have happened.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. So we have time for one last question, and somebody's asking about England and their commitment to winning the war. Did they have one hand tied behind their back, or did they fully put all their effort into the war?
Well, they certainly put all of their effort into the war after Saratoga. But the problem the English faced was that they were fighting now a world war. They first were fighting France, and then a year later, Spain came into the war. The Dutch were helping the Americans before it was over, and the British had to defend their home islands against the French. They had to defend their colonies in the Caribbean. They had colonies over in the Far East, and so did France. So they had troops over there, even the troops in Africa, for that matter. And then they were fighting in America, and they were just stretched too thin at that point. And so it's remarkable that they came as close to getting something out of this as they did. And that's one reason that I hope that my book will lead to something of a reassessment of Sir Henry Clinton, because I think he was the major player in that regard.
Okay. That about does it for tonight. So thanks to our author, Mr. Ferling, for coming out. And once again, this is his new book here, Winning Independence. It's wonderful. And thanks for everybody for coming out. And we're looking forward to your next endeavor there.
All right. Well, thank you for having me. I've
You're quite
enjoyed
welcome.
it.
Thank you. Well, everybody,
Okay.
good night.